Alrighty, welcome back to another thrilling installment of Free Read Fridays. I'm your uh, intrepid narrator, Fraggith, and today we're starting a new literary endeavor in the form of Destination Void by some guy I don't think anyone's ever heard of called Frank Herbert. May have written something about sand. I don't know. Um, can't remember the name of that one. Anyway. So this is a lesser known brainchild of the man, the myth, the legend, um, that somebody years ago, I think, requested on the channel. And we're finally getting around to it. Actually, I think they requested the Jesus incident. So we're getting to that, though. That's why we're reading this. Because the Jesus incident is a direct sequel to this, sort of, kind of. Okay, it's a sequel anyway. You'll see what I mean when we get there. And it's pretty wild. I think I have to have it described. Oh, I did not turn off. There we go. Whoops. Um, I think I have it described in the stream description as a combination of if you've read Blindsight, if you've read 2001: A Space Odyssey, and if you've read um, Under Pressure. This is sort of like if those got together and mixed their genes, even though it predates two of those. And one of them is just in quotes, another Frank Herbert story. Um, I mostly compare it to Under Pressure in the sense that it feels kind of claustrophobic. Um, the pressure, uh, the pressure is on. They're not under the sea, but they are in the final frontier, the Sea of Stars. You know. So we actually, one of the perks of this particular book is we have a fairly limited cast. I'm only going to have to remember like 4 or 5 voices um, throughout. Things are going to get a lot more complicated when we hit the Jesus incident. That's um, that's going to be pretty wild. So I'm probably going to have the characters down pretty early. Um, and I'm not going to spoil too much. I don't think I have yet. Boy, I hope I haven't. If I have, that's embarrassing. I don't think I did. Anyway, this is it's quite a book. This is, quote, the revised edition, unquote. I think he mentions what got revised in the afterword, which we will reread. It was, I think, originally published in Galaxy Magazine as Do I Wake or Do I Dream? The original short story that this is based off of, and then radically expanded upon. I believe that's what it was called, Do I Wake or Do I Dream? Anyway, um, yeah, I'll leave the epilogue for the end, even though the epilogue is kind of the foreword. But we'll get cracking. So this is not the original form. This is the revised one from 1965. Um, no, Do I Sleep or Wake was 1965. This is from 66. Sorry. Anyway, we'll get cracking. These are going to be somewhat longer chunks than we've been doing because I need to pound through it in time to have it done by the start of August. We will see how that goes. I have some tentatives laid out that should cover us pretty handily, and we'll go from there. Okie doke! Sit back, relax, get drinkables if you need them, get nibblables if you need them. Keep an eye out for your boss if you're listening to this at work, and which you should be. That's the best time to do it. And that's right, Frag. Be a bad influence. And enjoy, hopefully. Destination Void by Frank Herbert. I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. Frightful must it be, for supremely frightful would be the effect of any human endeavor to mock the stupendous mechanism of the Creator. Mary Shelley on the creation of Frankenstein. Prologue. It was the fifth clone ship to go out from the moon base on Project Consciousness, and he leaned forward to watch it carefully as his duty demanded. The view it showed the view showed it passing the Pluto orbit, and he knew that by this time the crew had encountered the usual programmed frustrations, even some deaths and serious injuries, but that was the pattern. Earthling, it was called. Earthling number 5. The ship was a giant egg, one half of it a dark shadow lambent on a starry background, the other half reflecting silver from the distant sun. A nervous cough sounded from the darkness behind him, and he suppressed a sympathetic repetition of that sound. Others were not as self-controlled. By the time the coughing spasms had subsided, the Earthling had begun to make its turn. The movement was impossible, but there was no denying what they all saw. The ship turned through 180 degrees and reversed, heading directly back down its outward track.
"Any clue at all on how they did that?"
he asked.
No, sir, nothing. I want you to go through the message capsule again," he said. "We're missing something."
Yes, sir. It was a sigh of resignation. Someone else spoke from the darkness. Get ready for the capsule launching. Yes, they'd all seen this enough to anticipate the sequence. The capsule was a silver needle that looped from the Earthling's stern. It held to the ship's blind spot, who knew what weapons such a ship might produce, until it was lost among the stars. From beneath their view a flame darted, the laser relay with its destruct message. A purple glow touched the ship's bulbous nose. It held for no more than 3 heartbeats before the ship exploded in a blinding orange blossom. That flattery model sure is that flattery model is sure as hell reliable, someone said. Nervous laughter went around the room, but he ignored it, concentrating on the viewer. Why the hell did they always think it was the flattery model? It could be anyone on the crew. Their view closed on the swollen blossom with the collapsing speed of time-lapse which made the explosion's orange light wink out too rapidly. Presently the movement slowed, and their view moved into the spreading wreckage, probing with crystalline flares of light until it found what it sought, the recording box. That and the message capsule were the most important elements remaining from this failure. Claw retractors could be seen grabbing the recording box and pulling it back beneath their view. The crystalline light continued to probe. Anything they saw here could be valuable. but the light picked out nothing but twisted metal, torn shreds of plastic, and, here and there, limbs and other parts of the crew. There was one particularly brutal glimpse of a head with part of a shoulder and an arm that ended just below the elbow. Bloody frost globules had formed around the head, but they still recognized it.
Tim,
Someone said. A woman's voice far to the rear of the room could be heard repeating, "Shit, shit, shit," until someone silenced her. The view blanked out, and he leaned back, feeling the ache between his shoulders. He knew he would have to identify that woman and have her transferred. No mistaking the near hysteria in her voice. Some harsh catharsis was indicated. He shut down the holopack's controls, flicked the switch for the room lights, then stood and turned in the blinking brilliance.
they're clones,
He said, keeping his voice cold.
They are not human. They are clones, as is indicated by their uniform middle name of Lon. They are property. Anybody who forgets that is going off Moonbase in the next shuttle. That sign on my door says Morgan Hempstead, Director. There will be no more emotional outbursts in this room as long as I am Director.
Chapter 1.
We call it Project Consciousness, and our basic tools are the carefully selected clones, our doppelgangers. The motivator is frustration. Thus we design into our system false goals and things which will go wrong. That's why we chose Tau Ceti as the target. There is no livable planet at Tau Ceti.
Morgan Hempstead. Lectures at Moonbase.
It's dead,
Bickle said. He held up the severed end of a feeder tube, stared at the panel from which he had cut it. His heart was beating too fast, and he could feel his hands trembling. Fluorescent red letters 8 centimeters high spelled out a warning on the panel in front of him. The warning seemed a mockery after what he had just done. Organic mental core, to be removed only by life systems engineer. Bickle felt an extra sense of quiet in the ship. Something, not someone, though, he thought, was gone. It was as though the molecular stillness of outer space had invaded the Earthlings' concentric hulls and spread through to the heart of this egg-shaped chunk of metal hurtling toward Tau Ceti. His two companions were wrapped in this silence, Bickle saw. They were afraid to break the quiet moment of shame and guilt and anger and relief.
What else could we do?
Bickle demanded. He held up the severed tube, glared at it. Raja Lon Flattery, their psychiatrist chaplain, cleared his throat, said, "Easy, John. We share the blame equally." Bickle turned his glare on Flattery, noted the man's quizzical expression, calculated and penetrating, the narrow, haughty face that somehow focused a sense of terrible superiority within remote brown eyes and upraked black eyebrows.
You know what you can do with your blame,
Bickle growled, but Flattery's words destroyed his anger, made him feel defeated. Bickle swung his attention to Timberlake. Gerald Lon Timberlake, Life Systems Engineer, the man who should have taken responsibility for this dirty business.
Timberlake, a quick and nervous scarecrow of a man with skin almost the color of his brown hair, stared at the metal deck near his feet, avoiding Bickle's eyes. Shame and fear, that's all Tim feels, Bickle thought. Timberlake's weakness, his inability to kill the OMC even when it meant saving the ship with its thousands of helpless lives, had almost killed them. And all the man could feel now was shame and fear. There had been no doubt about what had to be done. The OMC had gone mad, a wild, runaway consciousness. It had been a sick ball of gray matter whose muscles turned every servo on the ship into a murder weapon, who stared out at them with madness from every sensor, who raged gibberish at them from every vocoder. No, there had been no doubt, not with 3 of their number murdered, and the only wonder was that they had been allowed to destroy it. Perhaps it wanted to die, Bickle thought. And he wondered if that had been the fate of the 6 other project ships which had vanished into nothingness without a trace. Did their OMCs run wild? Did their umbilicus crews fail when it was kill or be killed? A tear began sliding down Timberlake's left cheek. To Bickle, that was the final blow. Some of his anger returned. He faced Timberlake. "What do we do now, Captain?" The title's irony was not lost on either of Bickle's companions. Flattery started to reply, thought better of it. If the starship Earthling could be said to have a captain, discounting an in-service organic mental core, then unspoken agreement gave that title to an umbilicus crew's life systems engineer. None of them, though, had ever used the word officially. At last Timberlake met Bickle's stare, but all he said was, "You know why I couldn't bring myself to do it?" Bickle continued to study Timberlake. What shabby conceit had given them this excuse for a life systems engineer? Once the umbilicus crew had numbered 6, the 3 here plus ship nurse Maida Lon Blaine, tool specialist Oscar Lon Anderson, and biochemist San Lon Sheeler. Now Blaine, Anderson, and Sheeler were dead. Sheeler's exploded corpse jamming an access tube on the aft perimeter. Anderson strangled by a rogue sphincter lock, and lovely Maida mangled by runaway cargo. Bickle blamed most of the tragedy on Timberlake. If the damn fool had only taken the ruthless but obvious step at the first sign of trouble. There had been plenty of warning, with the first 2 of the ship's 3 OMCs going catatonic. The seat of trouble had been obvious, and the symptoms, exactly the same symptoms that had preceded the breakdown of the old artificial consciousness project back on Earth, insane destruction of people and materiel. But Tim had refused to see it. Tim had blathered about the sanctity of all life. Life! Ha! Bickle thought. They were all of them, even the colonists down in the hive tanks, expendable biopsy material, doppelgangers grown in notobiotic sterility in the moon base. Untouched by human hands. That had been their private joke. They had known their Earth-born teachers only as voices and doll-sized images on cathode screens of the base intercom system, and only occasionally through the triple glass at the locks that sealed off the sterile creche. They had emerged from the axolotl tanks to the padded metal claws of nursemaids that were servo-extensors of moon-base personnel, forever barred from intimate contact with those they served. Out of contact. That's the story of our lives, Bickle thought, and the thought softened his anger at Timberlake. Timberlake had begun to fidget under Bickle's stare. Flattery intervened. "Well, we'd better do something," he said. He had to get them moving, Flattery knew. That was part of his job. Keep them active, working, moving, even if they moved into open conflict. That could be solved when and if it happened. "Raj is right," Timberlake thought. "We have to do something." He took a deep breath, trying to shake off his sense of shame and failure, and the resentment of Bickle. Damned Bickle, superior Bickle, special Bickle, the man of countless talents, Bickle, upon whom their lives depended. Timberlake glanced around at the familiar command central room in the ship's core, a space 27 meters long and 12 meters on the short axis. Like the ship, Com Central was vaguely egg-shaped. Four cocoon-like action couches with almost identical control boards lay roughly parallel in the curve of the room's wider end. Color-coded pipes and wires, dials and instrument controls, switch banks and warning telltales spread patterned confusion against the gray metal walls. Here were the necessities for monitoring the ship and its autonomous consciousness, an organic mental core. Organic mental core, Timberlake thought, and he felt the full return of his feelings of guilt and grief. Not human brain, oh no, an organic mental core. Better yet, an OMC. The euphemism makes it easier to forget that the core once was a human brain in an infant monster, doomed to die. We take only terminal cases, since that makes the morality of the act less questionable. And now we've killed it. I'll tell you what I'm going to do, Bickle said. He looked at the accept and translate board auxiliary to the transmitter on his personal control console. Console. I'm sorry. I'm going to report back to Moonbase what's happened. He turned from the raped panel. Huh? He turned from the raped panel, dropped the severed feeder tube to the deck without looking at it. The tube drifted downward slowly in the ship's quarter-gravity. We've no code for this kind of emergency. Timberlake confronted Bickle, stared angrily at the man's square face, disliking every feature of it from the close-cropped blonde hair to the wide mouth and pugnacious jaw. I know, Bickle said as he stepped around Timberlake. I'm sending it clear speech. You can't do that, Timberlake protested, turning to glare at Bickle's back. Every second's delay adds to the time lag, Bickle said. As it is, it has to go more than a fourth of the way across the solar system. He dropped into his couch, set the cocoon to half unclose him, swung the transmitter into position. You'll be blatting it to everyone on Earth, including you-know-who, Timberlake said. Because he half agreed with Timberlake and wanted to gain time, Flattery moved to a position looking down on Bickle in the couch. What specifically are you going to tell them? I'm not about to mince words, Bickle retorted. He threw the transmitter warm-up switches, began checking the sequence tape. I'm going to tell them we had to unhook the last brain from the ship's controls and kill it in the process. They'll tell us to abort, Timberlake said. The merest hesitation of his hands on the tape punch keyboard told that Bickle had heard. And what'll you say happened to the brains? Flattery asked. They went nuts, Bickle said. I'm just going to report our casualties. That's not precisely what happened, Flattery said. We'd better talk this over, Timberlake said, and felt the beginnings of desperation. Look, you, Bickle said, shifting his attention to Timberlake. You're supposed to be crew captain on this chunk of tin, and here we are drifting without any hands on the controls at all. He returned his attention to the keyboard. You think you're qualified to tell me what to do? Timberlake went pale with anger. Bickle defeats me so easily, he thought. He muttered, the whole world will be listening. But he turned away to his own couch, jacked in the temporary controls they had rigged shortly after the first ship brain had begun acting up. Presently he sank onto the couch, tested the computer circuits, and asked for course data. The organic mental cores did not go nuts, Flattery said. You can't. As far as we're concerned, they did. Bickle threw the master switch. A skin-creeping hum filled Com Central as the laser amplifiers built up to full potential. I could stop him, Flattery thought as Bickle fed the voco tape into the transmitter, but we have to get the message out, and clear speech is the only way. There came the click, click, click as the message was compressed and multiplied for its laser jump across the solar system. With a chopping motion that carried its own subtle betrayal of self-doubt, Bickle slapped the orange transmitter key. He sank back as the transmit command sequence took over. The sound of relays snapping closed dominated the ovoid room. Do something even if it's wrong, Flattery reminded himself. The rule books don't work out here, and now it's too late to stop Bickle. It came to Flattery then that it had been too late to stop Bickle from the moment their ship left its moon orbit. This direct authoritarian violent man, or one of his backups in the hive tanks, held the key to the Earthlings' real purpose. The rest of them were just along for the ride. At the sound of the relays snapping, Timberlake reached up to a hand grip, squeezed it fiercely in frustration. He knew he could not blame Bickle for feeling angry. The dirty job of killing their last organic mental core should have fallen to the life systems engineer. But surely Bickle must know the inhibitions that had been droned into the life systems specialist. For just a moment, Timberlake allowed his mind to dwell on the sterile creche and labs back on the moon, the only home any of the Earthlings' occupants had ever known. Man's greatest adventure, the jump to the stars. They had lived with that awesome concept from their first moments of awareness. Aboard the Earthling, they were a hand-picked lot, 3,006 survivors of the toughest weeding out process the project directors could devise for their doppelganger charges. The final 6 had been the choicest of the choice, the umbilicus crew to monitor the ship until it left the solar system, then tie off the few manual controls and turn the 200-year crossing to Tau Ceti over to that one lonely consciousness, an organic mental core. And while the 3006 lay dormant behind the hive tank's water shields in the heart of the ship, their lives were to remain subject to the servos and sensors surgically linked to the OMC. But now with 3003, Timberlake thought with that sense of grief, of shame and defeat, and our last OMC is dead. Timberlake felt alone and vulnerable now, faced by their emergency controls. He had been reasonably confident while the brains existed and with one of them responsible for ultimate ship security. The existence of emergency controls had only added to his confidence. Then, now, staring at the banks of switches, the gauges and telltales and manuals, the auxiliary computer board with its paired vocoder and tape code inputs and readouts, now Timberlake realized how inadequate were his poor human reactions in the face of the millisecond demands for even ordinary emergencies out here. The ship's moving too fast, he thought. Their speed was slow, he knew, compared to what they should have been doing at this point. But still it was too fast. He activated a small sensor screen on his left, permitted himself a brief look at the exterior cosmos, staring out at the hard spots of brilliance that were stars against the energy void of space. As usual, the sight reduced him to the feeling that he was a tiny spark at the mercy of unthinking chance. He blanked the screen. Movement at his elbow drew Timberlake's attention. He turned to see Bickle come up to lean against a guide pole beside the control console. There was such a look of relief on his face that Timberlake had a sudden insight, realizing that Bickle had sent his guilt winging back to Moonbase with that message. Timberlake wondered then what it had felt like to kill, even if the killing had involved a creature whose humanity had become hidden behind an aura of mechanistics long years back when it was removed from a dying body. Bickle studied the drive board. They had disabled the drive increment system when the second OMC had started going sour. But the Earthlings still would be out of the solar system in 10 months. 10 months, Bickle thought. Too fast and too slow. During those 10 months, the computed possibility of a total ship emergency remained at its highest. The umbilicus crew had not been prepared for that kind of pressure. Bickle shot a covert glance at Flattery, noting how silent and withdrawn the psychiatrist chaplain appeared. There were times when it rasped Bickle's nerves to think how little could be hidden from Flattery, but this was not one of those times. Out here, Bickle realized, each of them had to become a specialist on his companions. Otherwise, ship pressures coupled to psychological pressures might destroy them.
How long do you suppose it'll take Moonbase to answer?
Bickle asked, directing the question at Timberlake. Flattery stiffened, studied the back of Bickle's head. The question, such a nice balance of camaraderie and apology in the voice. Bickle had done that deliberately, Flattery realized. Bickle went deeper than they had suspected, but perhaps they should have suspected. He was, after all, the Earthling's pivotal figure. It'll take 'em a while to digest it, Timberlake said. I still think we should have waited. Wrong tack, Flattery thought. An overture should be accepted. He brushed a finger along one of his heavy eyebrows, and moved forward with a calculated clumsiness, forcing them to be aware of him. Their first problem's public relations, Flattery said. That'll cause some delay. Their first question'll be why'd the OMCs fail, Timberlake said. There was no medical reason for it, Flattery put in. He realized he had spoken too quickly, sensed his own defensiveness. It'll turn out to be something new, something nobody anticipated. Wait and see, Timberlake said.
Something nobody anticipated?
Bickle wondered. And he doubted that, but held his silence. For the first time since coming aboard, he felt the bulk of the Earthling around him, and thought of all the hopes and energies that had launched this venture. It occurred to him then what a mountain of hard-headed planning had gone into the project. He sensed the sleepless nights, the skull sessions of engineers and scientists, the pragmatic dreamers tossing their ideas back and forth across coffee cups and butt-mounded ashtrays.
Something nobody anticipated? Hardly.
Still, 6 other ships had vanished into silence out here. 6 other ships much like their Earthling. He spoke then more to keep up his own courage than to argue.
This isn't the kind of thing they'd let go by the board. Moonbase'll have a plan. Somebody, somewhere along the line, thought of this possibility.
Then why didn't they prepare us for it? Timberlake asked. Flattery watched Bickle carefully, aware of how that question had touched him. He will begin to have doubts now, Flattery thought. Now he will start asking himself the really loaded questions. Chapter 2.
The holoscan you are watching at this moment is of our Bickle model, our most successful organ of analysis. He is charged to explore beyond the imprinted patterns of consciousness which humankind inherits with its genes.
Morgan Hempstead, Lectures at Moonbase. Timberlake adjusted a dial on his console to correct a failure of automatic temperature adjustment in quad 3 ring 9 of the ship's second shell.
We should have been buttoned down in our hob tanks and on our way over the solar hump to Tau Ceti long ago, he muttered.
Tim, display the time log, Flattery said. Timberlake hit the green key in the upper right corner of his board, glanced at the overhead master screen's display from the laser pulse time log. 10 months. Plus. The indefinite answer made it seem the Earthling's computer core shared their doubts. How long to Tau Ceti? Flattery asked.
At this rate?
Timberlake asked.
He risked a long glance away from his board. The stare he aimed at Flattery betrayed the fact that he had not thought of that possibility, making the trip the hard way, long and slow, with a crew active all the way.
Say 400 years, give or take a few, Bickle said, is the first question I fed into the computer after we disabled the drive increment.
He is too crystal sharp, Flattery thought. He bears watching lest he shatter.
And Flattery chided himself then.
But the job Bickle has to do requires a man who can shatter. But the job Bickle has to do requires a man who can shatter.
First thing we'd better do is bring up one replacement from the hive tanks, Bickle said.
Flattery glanced to his left, where Comm Central's other 3 action couches lay with their cocoon arms open, empty and waiting.
Bring up only one replacement, eh? Flattery asked. Live in here?
We may need occasional sleep rest periods in the cubby lockers, Bickle said, and he nodded toward the side hatch into their Spartan living quarters. But Comm Central is the safest spot on the ship.
What if Project What if Project orders us to abort? Timberlake asked.
That won't be their first order, Bickle said. 7 nations invested one hell of a pile of money and effort and dreams in this business. They have a purpose which they won't give up easily.
Too crystal sharp, Flattery thought, and he asked, Who are you nominating for D-Hybe?
Prudence Weygand, M.D.,
Bickle said. You think we need another doctor, eh? Flattery asked.
I think we need Prudence Weygand. She's a doctor, sure, but she can also function as a nurse to replace Ida. She's a woman, and we may need female thinking. You have any objections to Weygand, Tim?
What's my opinion worth? Timberlake muttered. You two've decided it, haven't you?
Bickle already had turned toward his own action couch. He hesitated at the petulance in Timberlake's voice, then went on to the couch, pulled the full vacuum suit from the rack beneath the couch, and began suiting up. He spoke without turning.
I'll take over here while you and Raj bring her out of Hybe. You'd both better suit up, too, and stay suited. Without an OMC at the controls...
He shrugged, finished sealing the suit, and stretched out in his action couch.
I'll take the red switch on the count.
Timberlake was caught up then in the changeover. The masterboard swung across on its travelers, stopped as it made junction with Bickle's console. What if Moonbase answers while we're in the tanks? Flattery asked. We won't be able to stop the D-Hybe and come up for it.
What's to do except record the message? Bickle asked.
He began adjusting hull integrity sensors, finished that, checked the accept and translate system, swung the AAT board close beside him where he could see its telltale when Moonbase replied. AAT, of course, being short for accept and translate. Flattery shrugged, got out his own full vacuum suit. He noted that Timberlake already was suiting up, but with a fumbling reluctance. Tim senses Bickle taking absolute command, Flattery thought, but he doesn't know the necessity for it, and he cannot bring himself to like it. He will, though. Bickle satisfied himself the ship was functioning as well as it could without the homeostatic control of an OMC. He sank back to watch the board as the others left Comm Central. The hatch seals hissed, and there came the metallic slap of the magnetic locks as the hatch closed and resealed itself. Now Bickle felt the ship around him as though he had neural connections to every sensor revealed on his board. The Earthling lay spread out for him, a monstrous juggernaut, yet fragile as an egg. A tin egg. Against his will, Bickle's attention drifted toward that dead light on the lower left corner of his board. The light that should have been glowing a live yellow to denote that all was well with the OMC. But all was not well with the OMC. The unsleeping brains had failed.
They were stress-tested for every conceivable situation, Bickle told himself. Something inconceivable happened.
or did it?
Timberlake's question nagged at him.
Why didn't they prepare us for it?
The master board above him grew a line of yellow lights that told him the ship's gravity center had shifted. A wild shift in the gravity field had torn colony cargo from its hold downs and killed Maida. Gently, to avoid oscillations, Bickle began adjusting controls to bring the field back into line.
How much simpler it would have been to get along without gravity, he thought.
But medical science had never really solved the problem of the human physical deterioration that resulted from existence in prolonged null gravity. The balance mechanism of the inner ear still was the most susceptible. 4 to 5 weeks without gravity brought permanent damage for some subjects. So they lived with the minimal field system, the gravity field mechanism that had been developed. The gravity field mechanism that had developed an unexpected deadly bug out here. The telltale lights began to wink out. Bickle followed the balance readjustment carefully. They had only the most tenuous theory on what caused that field to shift this way. They suspected local anomalies as they moved through the solar system's own gravitational field. The last telltale went dark. Bickle sank back onto the couch, drew a deep, ragged breath. Perspiration covered his body, and he felt his suit's system laboring to compensate. This watch on Comm Central could become a particular kind of hell, Bickle realized. The suspenseful responsibility, duel with an unknown death, wore you down. You controlled only the most essential ship functions from here. Monitor instruments had never been intended for this work. Fine adjustments and delicate repairs had to be ignored until they reached the point of gross demand where a crewman had to be sent out to direct the servos in their work. An increment of damage could be computed, the kind of damage, one thing added to another, where the ship itself would cease operating. There was a death point for the ship out ahead of them, and it could be computed as a function of damage. Bickle avoided feeding the problem into the computer. He knew his own limits. Precise knowledge of that unknown moment would hamper him less unless it became a matter of immediacy. They had months yet, perhaps the full 10. And 10 months was forever, the way things now stood. The ship was far more likely to meet disaster in some other form. He could feel it. Something about the tin egg was sour. Big sour. It did not make sense to Bickle that a man had to sit here in Comm Central, the strain of responsibility increasing with each heartbeat, waiting and knowing some mechanism or balancing function of the ship was headed for trouble, yet unable to meet the problem with more than a gross, clumsy makeshift. With the OMCs, this ship balance had been a finely tuned neuro-servo reflex, almost automatic, as homeostatic in response as that of a healthy human body. Bickle added his own corollary question now to the one Timberlake had posed. Why were all the eggs put in one basket? Chapter 3.
What matters most is the search itself. This is more important than the searchers. Consciousness must dream. It must have a dreaming ground. And dreaming must invoke ever new dreams.
Morgan Hempstead, Lectures at Moonbase. As she awoke, Prudence thought, "We made it." Excitement filled her at the thought of stepping out onto a virgin world with all its strange newness and never-before problems. 6 failures were worth it. The 7th try was a charm. We have succeeded. Otherwise... Her mind bogged down in sluggishness. Otherwise was a concept with several pathways out of it. The tingle ache of dehybe ran along the muscles of her arms and legs. produced transient knots of pain. She knew as a doctor the reasons for the pain, could rationalize the fact of it. Human hibernation was a far different process from animal hibernation. The difference there is hibernation, as in hive tanks, is Hybernation, as opposed to hibernation with an I, from animals. Not a drop of water could remain in the body, and you went so close to the borders of death that some contended you were suspended within death. Seems slightly familiar? She tried to sit up. It was then she saw Timberlake and Flattery looking down at her where she lay on the lab shuttle. Their expressions brought "otherwise" into full focus. For a moment she looked beyond them to the tubes and stimulant plugs that had been removed from functional contact with her body. Flattery restrained her. "Easy now, Dr. Wayland," he said. Dr. Wayland, she thought. Not Prudence, not Prue. Dr. Wayland. Cold formality. She began losing that first elation. Then Flattery began explaining in his soft, soothing voice, and she knew her elation had to be put away. The contingency problem had arisen. She had been awakened for that. "Just tell me who we lost," she said, and her throat hurt from its months of disuse. Timberlake told her. "3 dead?" she said. She didn't ask how they had died. The other problem, the contingency for which she had been prepared, took precedence over mere curiosity.
Bickle requested you be brought out of hide,
Flattery said. "Does he know why?" she asked, ignoring the strange look Timberlake shifted from her to Flattery. "He rationalized it," Flattery said, and he wished she'd withheld these questions until they were alone. Of course he did. Of course he did," she said, "but he hasn't posed the problem yet," Flattery said. "Don't push him," she said, and glanced at Timberlake. "Forget what you just heard here, Tim." Timberlake scowled, suddenly withdrawn and wary. Flattery bent over her right arm with a slap-shot hypo in his hand. "Must you?" she asked. Then, "Yes, of course." "There's nothing for you to do right now except recuperate," he said, and pressed the slap-shot against her arm. She felt the mechanisms kick and, presently, the soft spread of narcosis. Flattery and Timberlake became wavering figures, haloed in light. "At least Bickle is still alive," she thought. "We do not have to replace him with a backup. Take second best." And just before sinking into the downy cloud of sleep, she wondered, how did Maida die? Lovely Maida, who... Timberlake watched the film of withdrawal wash over her light blue eyes. Her breathing took on soft regularity. As life system specialist, Timberlake had checked the computer-filed tape flag for every person on the tin egg. He recalled now that Prudence Lawn Wagand was classed superb as surgeon, superior 9 in tool facility, and the scale went only to 10. He reflected now on her strange conversation with Flattery and realized the tape had not told the full story. She obviously had ship functions beyond surgeon-ecologist, and at least one of these functions concerned Bickle. "Forget what you just heard here, Tim." Timberlake could still hear that cold-voiced command, and he knew it did not square with the emotional index on Prudence Lawn Wagand's tapes. There she was listed as Place 9D Green on the compassionate vector. In the close quarters living of this umbilicus crew, that emotional index posed problems because of its tightly linked sex drive. With a sense of shock, Timberlake took a closer look at her feed tube spectrum on the Hive chart, saw that she had been fed the sex-suppressant anti-S drugs even under Hive. She had been kept ready.
Ready for what? He asked himself.
Flattery closed and locked her litter cocoon, said, "She'll sleep until she's almost back to normal. We'd better get her a full vac suit out of stores. She'll need it when she comes out." Timberlake nodded, made a last check on the few remaining life systems linkages into her litter. Flattery was acting very odd. Mysterious. "You can ignore all that conversation as she woke up," Flattery said. "Common dehybe confusion. You know how it is."
But she was fed anti-S drugs in hibernation,
Timberlake thought. Flattery nodded toward the hatch into Comm Central, said, "John's been almost 4 hours alone on the board. Time he got some relief." Timberlake finished his inspection of the litter gauges, turned, led the way through the hatch. Seeing the wary, thoughtful look on Timberlake's face, Flattery thought, "Damn that woman's big mouth. If Tim says the wrong thing to Bickle now, it could muddy the whole project." Oh, sorry I didn't see you there, Derpy Shark. Welcome to the stream. Thanks for tuning in. Chapter 4.
The legal status of the clone as property cannot be questioned. This is a decision we have taken as a species for the survival of the species. The clone is a spare parts bank and much more. The clone falls outside the legal prohibition against experiments upon humans without their informed consent. Clones are property, and that's that.
Morgan Hempstead. Lectures at Moonbase. Bickle heard Flattery and Timberlake enter Comm Central, but was forced to keep his attention on the big board. An odd timed pulse had appeared in the primary loops of the navigational analog banks of the computer. It appeared and vanished with no apparent cause. Each oddity of computer function forced a review of that basic question. Why had the OMCs failed? Was this strange pulse a thing for which the brains were unprepared? How could it be when every last OMC circuit tested open and operating? The answer to the OMC failure lay in the psychological area, Bickle felt. The seat of the problem was in that one place where they could not stick their probes, in the gray matter that once had been part of a human.
Well, I know we have to tackle this mess, Bickle thought, but will the others go along?
Bickle heard Flattery slide into his own action couch, risked a glance at the man. Flattery might be difficult to handle. Flattery was an MD, and ship-trained, yes. He could stand a watch, repair the simpler servos and sensors, and obey the ordinary precautions that spelled out life system security. There was another Flattery, though, the psychiatrist chaplain. To Bickle, the psychiatrist half of the man suggested special usefulness, but the enigma of the chaplain offered only mysticism and open-end arguments.
I never know which mask Flattery's wearing, Bickle thought.
He wished then that there could have been a way to avoid having a chaplain on the tin egg. But there had been no way. The world's religious millions paid an enormous amount in taxes. The psychiatrists, in training Flattery and his backups, had approached the job sincerely. They had had little choice. It had been a long time since psychiatrists denied they served a witch doctor function, and the step from witch doctor to divine was a short one. Timberlake came up beside Bickle, studied the gauge which showed the timed pulse in the navigational analog banks.
That acts like a Doppler reference pulse from the time log, he said. You been checking our position?
No, Bickle said, and as he spoke, the answer to this variant pulse clicked home in his mind. He had set up a telltale warning net in the computer to alert him when the ship damage reached a critical point. Damage to the navigational system could be most critical, especially internal damage. But unlike destruction of hardware, that internal damage would only betray itself by position errors. His telltale circuitry had alerted one of the ship computer's master programs. A running Doppler reference check was being made on their position. Bickle shifted to the computer board, ran a series trial on the navigational loops, read the induced resonance off the pulsing gauges. It checked. He explained what was happening. The computer acts almost human, Flattery said. Bickle and Timberlake exchanged a knowing smile. Almost human indeed. The damn thing merely was doing what it was designed to do.
We'd better take the computer schematics and the design specs and have a real skull session on what the lack of an OMC may be doing to it,
Timberlake said. Bickle nodded. He was thankful then that Timberlake was, in many respects, as good an electronics man as anyone on the ship, the necessary foundation for his specialty. There was always that almost qualification on his abilities, though. Life systems work trapped men into a generalist corner. They knew plenty of biophysics, but they were not doctors. They were adept in electronics, but fell short of that smooth juggling of variables which marked the creative engineer. "You ready for a break, John?" Flattery asked.
Any time. How's Prue?
"Dr. Wagand is asleep now," Flattery said. "She needs a few more hours' recuperation."
Why is he so formal? Bickle wondered. Raj must know I shared classes with her. She was always Prue then. Why should she suddenly be Dr. Wagand?
"I'll take the board on the count," Flattery said, and they began the change of watch. Timberlake, sensing Bickle's questions, realized that Flattery's emphasis on Dr. Wagand had not been aimed at the electronics engineer.
Raj was saying something to me, Timberlake thought. He was telling me that Dr. Wagand may have had medical reasons for her strange behavior. Raj is telling me to keep my mouth shut.
And Timberlake found himself resenting the fact that Flattery had found the warning necessary. Bickle closed off his link to the controls, slipped off his couch, and began exercising the stiffness out of his muscles. Remembering the classes he had shared with Prue Wagand, computer math, servo sensor repair, ship function, he recalled the woman. She was a disturbing female plus creature, sensitive and with her feelings all too apparent. Bickle realized then that a photograph of Prue Wagand in repose would show a rather unassuming woman with regular features and a good but not sensational figure. She was the kind who attracted male stares, though. She radiated some vital, sparking thing, especially when she walked.
Is that why I chose her?
Bickle wondered. He broke off his exercises to consider the question. The Prue kind of woman represented a source of trouble in an otherwise all-male crew, unless they all went on anti-S. But they couldn't afford to dull their faculties that way.
I chose her because, in a ship of quintuple backup, she appears unique, Bickle reassured himself. She is trained in ecology, medicine, and computer math. She is going to be damned useful to us.
But doubts remained. Bickle forced them out of his mind by looking around Com Central, focusing his attention on the ship. The ship come computer come hibernating colonists. Here was one set of resources that Bickle felt that he could fit into a logical pigeonhole, assess and weigh and use as they needed. He sensed the ship stretching out from him in its 16 concentric shells, a great ovoid bulk almost a mile across its long axis. Beyond the water barrier and baffles that shielded the core lay miles of corridors and tubeways, self-sealing compartments. Through it all stretched the organized clutter of materiel needed to make life possible for humans in an alien environment. In the hive tanks they had 2,000 adult humans, 1,000 human embryos, and more than 6,000 animal embryos. A full ecological spectrum. Bickle turned, looked at his own computer board. His plan involved dangerous risk to the computer, but the risk was necessary.
The others might fight him, but they would have to come around. He looked at Flattery, busy on the big board, Timberlake taking a relaxing massage on his action couch. He looked back at the computer board. The Tin Eggs computer was basically a multi-system system. Yes, it says multi-system system. I did a double take there. The Tin Eggs computer was basically a multi-system system with internal ruby laser real-time clocks to log its own experiences. Real-time and experiences are in quotes. It incorporated more than 800,000 specialized routines, installed by a prodigious spending of manpower. Bickle weighed the computer's untried potential. Its tri-nanosecond thoughtput and multi-scheduling facilities allowed it to interleave thousands of programs simultaneously. It could monitor sequencing, queuing, and input through a core memory with enormous reserves of trapping functions, branching operations, and alarm systems networks. With an OMC tied in as supervisory program, as supreme decision maker, the computer and the ship it controlled had been a living creature of metal. But 3 brains had failed in that delicately powerful linkage, and Bickle the pragmatist trusted only that which worked. Without an OMC, the ship computer remained an inert mass of machinery whose output on demand followed a fixed design and could be accepted or rejected only after a human decision.
How long until Prue will be with us? Bickle asked.
About 3 hours,
Timberlake said.
I want her opinion on the post-mortem,
Bickle said.
I'm not satisfied with what we found in the first 2 brains.
Timberlake shut down his couch massage, directed a probing stare at Flattery. The psychiatrist chaplain only smiled, reminding himself that Bickle was logic-prone with a disregard of everything except the main line of reasoning that made him sound boorish at times.
Moonbase will ask some questions for which we have no answers, Bickle said. We can't afford to sound fumbling.
He looked at Timberlake.
They're going to take us apart, one by one. Life systems to... Life systems were perfect, Timberlake snapped. We'd better be able to prove it, Bickle said. I went through the entire console when Brain 1 failed, Timberlake said. Check it yourself. I did. A couple of things bothered me. Brain 1 preferred to be called Myrtle. Why? I find nothing in the memory core to explain that, except that Brain 1 was removed from a genetic monster that probably was female. Myrtle's personal life system tested within .002 of homeostatic center on the Anders base, Timberlake said.
Don't let that identity preference seduce you, Flattery said. It was for our benefit, so we would anthropomorphize the ship OMC.
Yeah, Bickle said. That's the reason they each gave, but is it the right one?
Those brains were as perfect as any ever born, Flattery said, and he wondered why he allowed Bickle's attitude to irritate him. Okay, they were raised from infancy as part of the total ship sensor servo system. So what? They didn't know any other life or want...
You said a couple of things that were bothering you, Timberlake interrupted. What's the other one?
Your life system support. Your... Oh, God. Sorry, one sec. We're good. Sorry.
You said a couple of things were bothering you, Timberlake interrupted. What's the other one?
Your life systems report, Bickle said. Entry 9107 on Myrtle. It says, none of the systems appear then to have been at fault. Why'd you use that word appear, Tim? You have some doubts you couldn't enter in the report?
Not a damn one, Timberlake said. Those systems are perfect. Were perfect.
Then why didn't you just say so? He was only being cautious, Flattery said. If you have checked the reports, you'll find my medical report confirms his findings in every respect. Except one, Bickle said.
And what is that?
Timberlake asked. He glared at Bickle, his face flushed. A muscle worked along his jaw. Bickle ignored the signs of anger, said, "Nothing explains the internal burn damage that Raj found in those brains." Internal burn damage, you say, especially along the overlarge axon collaterals of the afferent side. What the devil do you mean overlarge? Overlarge compared to what? A main channel leading into the brain's highest centers was about 4 times the size of anything I had ever seen, Flattery said. I don't know why, but I can guess it was compensatory growth. These OMCs had to handle many more incoming data bits from more sensors than the normal human ever encounters. You'll note that the frontal lobes were larger too, but the design specs on the OMC process explain all that, Bickle said. Compensatory growth, yeah, but I don't find one word about large axon collaterals. Not one word. These brains had been in the system longer than any of the other longer than any others ever examined, Timberlake said. The literature reports only on 4 previously that died of natural causes, and we... Natural causes? Bickle asked. What's a natural cause fatal to an OMC? You know what happened as well as I do, Flattery said. Accidents, irritant matter in the food bath, and radiation shield left down for... Human error, not OMC error, Bickle snapped. Not natural. And here is another thing. Myrtle lapsed into catatonia, or whatever you want to call it, just 10 days, 14 hours, 8 minutes, and 11 seconds from Moonbase. We threw Little Joe into service, and he lasted 6 days, 9 hours, 1 second. So we turned the ship over to Harvey, our last chance, and Harvey took 15 hours even. Kaput! Greater and greater stress, and they broke down faster and faster, Flattery said. But you'll notice that the last words from each betrayed a type of deterioration akin to schizo... Akin! Bickle sneered. That's what you see. Well, that's what you see all through these damn reports. Something similar to. A condition that reminds one of. Akin to. He glared from Flattery to Timberlake. The truth is, we don't know what the hell goes on in an OMC's gray matter. A clicking buzzing erupted from the master board above Flattery. Bickle waited while Flattery fought out a manual temperature adjustment in an inner hold. Presently, Flattery wiped perspiration from his forehead, studied his gauges to be certain the balance was holding. Man, that board is murder, Timberlake muttered. I don't wonder those OMCs caved in. Flattery risked a glance away from the board. You know better than that, Tim. This part of the job was child's play for a functioning OMC. They could handle most ship homeostasis problems by something akin to reflex action. Akin, Bickle said. All right, Flattery barked, and pretended to be busy with the board to hide his confusion at allowing Bickle to get to him that way. A long silence settled over Comm Central, broken when Flattery regained his composure and said, I was about to say that the end tapes on each brain show statements similar to schizophrenic writing. It makes a pretense of meaning, and sometimes stumbles onto a colorful phrase, but the essential... He broke off as the master board grew 3 diagonal stripes of flashing yellow. Flattery's hands darted to the controls as Bickle shouted, Grav shift! And dove for his couch. Cocoons snapped closed around them, and they felt the creeping, jerking weight shifts, the runaway fluctuation of the field centering system, the unexplained gravity variance that had killed Maida. Oh, thanks for tuning in, a cookie. Don't worry about being late. No need to get too stressed over that, methinks. Chapter 5. The thing about computers, it's like training a dog. You have to be smarter than the dog. If you make a computer smarter than you are, that has to be accident, synergy, or divine intervention. Interview with John Bickle, original, at La Paz.
Bickle watched Flattery's hands fight the gravity system back into balance. It had taken several bruising minutes, but the tugging and jerking had begun to ease. The system centered slowly. Flattery waited it out. Presently, he made a fine adjustment in the controls.
Where were we? Timberlake asked. We were raking through our data, seeking anything useful, Bickle said. It's a clumsy way to operate, but necessary.
Guilt sharing, Flattery said.
What?
Never mind, Flattery said. Back to square one. You will recall that OMC Myrtle said, I have no incarnation. That may have been the only accurate thing in her jabbering. After all, except for grey matter, she had no flesh. But then, remember, after a long silence, she said, I'm counting my fingers. She had no fingers, no conscious memory of fingers. And that final question, why are you all so dead? The best guess is that any meaning in these statements and questions was purely accidental.
I think she was referring to us, to the crew, Bickle said. It's nuts, yes, but it was a direct question over the vocoders, and we were the only possible audience.
Unless she was referring to the colonists in the hype tanks, Flattery said. They might appear dead under some...
Myrtle had direct contact with the hype tank's senses, Timberlake pointed out. She'd have known if they were alive.
Bickle nodded.
What do you make of little Joe roaring out over every vocoder in the ship? I'm awake! God help me, I'm awake!
A cry for help, perhaps, Flattery said. Most insane raving is a cry for help in one form or another.
That leaves Harvey, Bickle said. Harvey screamed, You're forcing me to be unhealthy. And when we... What could we do? Timberlake asked,
and Bickle heard the note of hysteria in his voice.
There was nothing wrong with any of their life systems. I know there wasn't.
Easy does it, Tim, Flattery said. That was just another nonsense statement.
We all knew what it meant, though, Bickle said. I did not see anybody showing surprise when Harvey said, I've lost it, and signed off permanently. And there we were, with 3 dead brains and no spares.
The callous way Bickle put it sent a shudder through Timberlake, and he could not explain it. He had never been deeply attached to the OMCs. There had always been something faintly accusing about the ship creatures. Raja Lon Flattery had assured him that this was strictly subjective, something from his own attitudes. Raj had always been so positive that the OMC ship computer entities were perfectly reconciled to their way of life, happy with their own compensations.
What compensations? Timberlake wondered. Expectancy of long life? But what is 3,000 or 4,000 years of living if each year is hell?
Timberlake realized then that none of the pat answers from his training classes really touched the basic issue of OMC happiness.
What if it really is a hellish way to live? He wondered. It must be. They are harnessed like engines to all this metal and glass and plastic, and time stretches out ahead of them forever. Maybe death was preferable. Maybe death was preferable.
Chapter 6. Every symbol has hidden premises behind it. Every word carries unspoken assumptions buried in the history of the language and the conditioning experiences of the speakers. If you snatch those buried meanings out of your words, you spill a whole stream of new understanding into your awareness. Raja Lon Flattery, The Book of Ship. Almost half of Prudence Wagon's recuperation time had passed, and it had been marked by recurrent uncomfortable silences in Comm Central. Flattery did not like those silences. He felt that every one of them carried his companions farther away, perhaps beyond control, and he had to maintain that delicate contact, that means of control. One of those silences gripped them now. It seemed to reach into them from the space beyond the ship's hull. Flattery knew he had to say something, but he felt oppressed by the silence. He cleared his throat before speaking. I wish to say something about anger. I've seen several shows of anger since our emergency, my own anger included. The formal tone, the set of his face, all signaled that Flattery was speaking officially as their chaplain. Anger could destroy us, he said. The proverbs warn us. He that is soon angry dealeth foolishly, and a man of wicked devices is hated. He that is slow to wrath is of great understanding, but he that is hasty of spirit exalteth folly. Let us practice the soft answer, and not stir up wrath. Bickle took a deep breath. Flattery was right, he knew, but Bickle resented the way the man retreated into religion to make his point. How much simpler just to say they were clouding their reason with excess emotion. That was the thing he resented about religion, Bickle thought, the way it appealed to emotion rather than intelligence. We've been floundering around, trying to do too much, Bickle said. That master board is a jury-rigged monstrosity. We need a consistent, organized plan to meet our problems. When Moonbase answers, I want to be able to say we have... Sharp, heavy G-force pressed him against the side of his couch cocoon. It struck without klaxon warning or alarm light. Cocoon's safety locks sealed home. Now, red alarm lights flashed with yellow in long webs across the master board. Flattery slammed the gravity disconnect with the heel of his left hand. G-force ebbed. Yellow alarm lights winked off as their pressure switches released. A line of red alarm lights remained. Damage to Hull 3, Section 6/14, Flattery said. He began activating remote sensors to inspect the area. Without conscious thought or discussion, Bickle took over ship command. Tim, take the G repeaters. Leave the gravity disconnected while you trace the relays and get the system back in balance. Timberlake pulled his board close to obey. Bickle swung the AAT board to his side, keyed for ship system/computer control, began feeding coded demands into the core recorders. What had the ship encountered that might explain that brutal deflection? What had the automatic sensors recorded? The responders began kicking out tape almost immediately. Much too fast. Data error, Flattery said, reading the output over Bickle's shoulder. In abrupt fury, Bickle pulled the master override stop from his core switch, jammed a set of jumper jacks across the AAT controls, opened the core system for standard reference comparison. You are into the core, Flattery said, his voice sharp with fear. You have no guide fuse or master reference. You could louse up the command routines. Unhook that! Timberlake shouted, lifting his head from the cocoon clamps to glare across at Bickle. Shut up, both of you. Sure, the core is delicate, but something in there is already loused up, bad enough to kill us. You think you have time to check some 800,000 routines? Timberlake demanded. Don't talk nuts. There are specific injunctions against what you are doing, Flattery said, fighting to keep his voice reasonable. And you know why. Don't try to tell me my job, Bickle said. While he spoke, Bickle rolled over core memory responders, direct contact, doing it gently to avoid current backlash. You make one mistake, Timberlake said, and it would take 6,000 or 7,000 technicians with a second master system and several thousand imprint relays to repair the damage. Are you ready to... Stop distracting me! What are you looking for? Flattery asked, interested in spite of his fear. He had realized that Bickle, conditioned to deep inhibitions against turning back, was incapable of doing anything to deprive them of one of their basic tools. I'm checking availability of peripherals from the core memory, Bickle said. There's got to be a bypass or pileup somewhere. It'll show in the acquisition and phase control loops of the input. He nodded toward a diagnostic meter on his board. And here we are. The meter's needle slammed against its pin, fell back to 0, stayed there. Slowly, Bickle ordered a master diagnostic routine into direct contact, put the core standard back on fused auxiliary, began rolling the troublesome core memory section. Working with only occasional references to the core standard, he forced the routine through the data reference channels as modified by new sensor input. Error branchings began clicking from his responders. Bickle translated aloud as the code figures appeared on the screen above his board. Core memory / prediction region rendered inactive. Proton mass and scatter relative to ship course / mass / speed did not agree with prediction. Aside, Bickle said, "We're hitting something other than hydrogen and hitting it in unexpected concentrations, partly because of our speed-mass figure."
Solar winds, Timberlake whispered. They said we... Solar winds, hell!
Bickle said, "Look at that!" He nodded at a code grouping as it worked its way across the screen.
26 protons in the mass,
Timberlake said. Iron, Bickle said. Free atoms of iron out here. We're getting a plain old-fashioned magnetic deflection of the grav field.
We'll have to slow the ship,
Timberlake said. Nuts! Bickle was emphatic. We'll put a fused overload breaker in the G system. I don't see why the devil the designers didn't do that in the first place. Perhaps they couldn't conceive of any force large enough to deflect the system, Flattery said. No doubt. Bickle's voice was heavy with disgust. But when I think a simple cage switch with a weight in it could have prevented Mida's death. They depended on the OMC's reflexes, too, Flattery said. You know that. What I know is that they thought in straight lines when they should have been thinking in the round, Bickle said. He unlocked his safety cocoon, shifted his suit to portable, launched himself diagonally across Comm Central to the tool and repair hatch. The weightless drifting reminded him they had a time limit on returning to gravity conditions. Too long without gravity, and the crew would suffer permanent physical damage. Chapter 7 I considered the being whom I had cast among mankind and endowed with the will and power to effect purposes of horror, a being whom I myself had formed and endued with life, had met me at midnight among the precipices of an inaccessible mountain. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Bickle grabbed a hatch handle to steady himself and swung out of the repair traveler. He opened a panel to get at the gravity system, identified the cables, and bent to his work. He went about it silently, angrily, with swift, decisive movements, and all the time he thought about their dilemma. Iron. Free ions of iron out here? Possible, but was there a simpler answer to the anomaly? Something that would produce an illusory report on their instruments? Was it possible that some part of the ship's computer / reporting system had been concealed from them, shielded away from their prying? He knew it not only was possible, but probable. Why would Moonbase do that? The complete answer escaped him, but he knew he would have to continue probing for it. Presently, he had an improvised cage switch clamped into the main power cable into the gravity generator. He made the connections to the breaker, tested the circuits with a false load, replaced the cover plate. It'll have to be reset manually each time, he said. He put a foot against the bulkhead, propelled himself back to his couch, locked in, glanced at Timberlake. System balanced? Near as you can tell from here, Timberlake said. Give it a try, Raj. Flattery checked to see that both Timberlake and Bickle were sealed in their cocoons, closed the gravity switch. The sound of the generators building up grew to a faint hiss that subsided as the system stabilized. Flattery felt the pressure against his shoulder blades, reached up to the board, slowly refined Timberlake's settings. Tim, Bickle said. I want the schematics for the OMC chamber, every sensor tie-coded for function, and laid out in layers from gross to fine. I'll need the same thing for servo control, a complete... Why? Timberlake asked. Are you thinking of tying in a colonist's brain? Flattery demanded, trying to hide his feelings of outrage at the idea.
A mature human brain probably wouldn't survive such a transfer,
Timberlake said. And he felt shame at how much the thought had appealed to him. Every inhibition of his training cried out against such a move. But if the OMC system were restored, none of them here ever again would have to undergo the nerve-crushing responsibility of that calm central master board. He looked up at the live green arrow denoting that Flattery had the controls, felt himself go clammy with fear at the thought of that arrow. Jesus. Sorry. I don't even know if you guys can hear that. I hope you can't. It's very loud. It's called a muffler, stupid. Jeez. But if the OMC system were restored, none of them here ever again would have to undergo the nerve-crushing responsibility of that calm central master board. He looked up at the live green arrow denoting that Flattery had the controls, felt himself go clammy with fear at the thought of that arrow swinging back to his position.
What the hell? Bickle snapped. Where'd you two get that idea? Not from anything I said.
He lifted his head from the cocoon clamps, looked from Timberlake to Flattery.
We don't know what happened to our 3 perfect brains. Why the devil do I want to tie in an untested one?
He sank back.
It's impossible anyway. A man should have some say in what's done to him. How could we poll everyone in the hive tanks? We can't wake them all.
You thinking of dismantling the OMC controls and converting us to a closed ecological system? Flattery asked. If you are, you should... He broke off as the high-pitched hum-buzz-hum of the AAT receiver filled the room, alerting them that a message was being processed. Bickle followed the play of lights across his boards as the message was gulped by the receivers, fed through the comparison blocks, refined to a single playback, with probable accuracy quotient logged beside each character, and finally was slowed to make it intelligible for human ears.
Sure as hell took 'em long enough,
Bickle thought. He read the time log, subtracted the distance lag.
Almost 7 hours.
He thought then of the first ships using the single-channel radio, punching their message across the solar system with only a few watts. But the error uncertainty factor built up with distance and cumulative adverse interference. The Tin Egg system had been engineered for computer-monitored automatic reports over stellar distances to tell watchers as yet unborn back on Earth how things fared with their star probe. The message ready chime sounded. Bickle keyed the vocoder. The voice of Morgan Hempstead, United Moonbase Director, rolled out from the speakers, recognizable and still with its iced iron overtones preserved by the AAT's comparators.
To UMB ship Earthling from Project Control. This is Morgan Hempstead. We hope you understand our distress and concern. Every decision from this point must have a prime motive of preserving the lives of yourselves and the colonists.
So much for the record, Flattery thought. There are 7 nations and 4 races represented in the hive tanks, but all just as expendable as the ones who went before us.
We have several prime questions,
Hempstead said.
I've a few questions of my own, Bickle thought.
Why was Project Control not alerted when the first organic mental core failed?
Hempstead asked. Bickle mentally logged the question. He knew the answer, but it was nothing he would ever transmit. Hempstead knew it as well as he did. The Tin Egg had momentum as an idea that had survived 6 failures. Nothing short of another ultimate failure would stop it. Nothing short of desperate emergency could make them risk aborting the mission by calling for help.
Doppler reference indicates you'll be out of the solar system in approximately 316 days at present stabilized speed, Hempstead said. Time to Tau Ceti, 400 plus years.
As he listened, Bickle pictured the man behind the voice. Flint-like face with gray hair and gray-blue eyes. That aura of momentous decision even in his smallest gesture. The Psych boys had called him Big Daddy behind his back, but they had jumped when he commanded. Now Bickle focused on the fact that they never again expected to see Hempstead, yet the man still could reach into their midst with his decisions.
First analysis indicates these possibilities, Hempstead went on. You could turn back to orbit around UMB until the problem is solved and new organic mental cores installed. That would return us to the old problem of sterile control under less than ideal conditions. It also would remove the ship from the situation of probable cause in the OMC breakdowns, perhaps making solution impossible.
He always was a long-winded bore, Timberlake said.
Second possibility, Hempstead said, would be for you to convert to a closed ecology and continue at present speed, enlisting replacements from your hibernation tanks, or breeding and raising your own crew complement. You would, of course, face high probability of genetic damage through the necessity of staying outside your core shield areas long enough to build quarters for prolonged occupation. However, food would be your major problem unless you adopted a more closely integrated recycling system.
Closely integrated recycling, Flattery said. He means cannibalism. It was discussed. Bickle turned to stare at Flattery. The idea of cannibalism was repellent, but that was not what had caught Bickle's attention. It was discussed. That simple statement contained volumes of unanswered questions and hidden implications. That's D-I-S-C-U-S-S-E-D, not D-I-S-G-U-S-T. I don't have the best audio rig, and some of that stuff doesn't always come through. So, just making it clear.
Third possibility, Hempstead was saying, would be to build the necessary consciousness into your robo-pilot, using the ship computer as a basis. Our computations indicate you have sufficient materials, including neuron packages intended for colony robots, in your stores. This is theoretically feasible. Theoretically feasible? Timberlake sneered. Does he think we've never heard about all the failures in... Shh! Flattery hissed. Project Council suggests you continue present course and speed, Hempstead said, as long as you are within the solar system. If a solution has not been reached by then, present opinion is that you will be ordered to turn back.
There followed a long silence. Then,
unless you have alternative suggestions.
You will be ordered to turn back, Flattery thought. He turned to see how those key words sat with Bickle. They were aimed at Bickle, contrived for him, fitted specially to trigger his deepest motives. Bickle lay in thoughtful silence, staring up at the speech microscope display above the vocoder, checking the accuracy of the message reception.
At this time, Hempstead said, Project Control requires a detailed report on condition of all ship systems with special reference to hibernating colonists. It is recognized that prolonging the voyage increases probability of hibernation failure. We recognize that you must replace crew losses from the tanks. Suggestions on replacements will be made upon request. We share your grief at the unfortunate accidents among you, but the project must continue. Detailed report on all ship systems, Timberlake said. He's out of his mind.
How cold was Hempstead's commiseration, Flattery thought. The phrasing betrayed the care with which it had been composed. Just enough grief, not too much. The vocoder emitted a filter-dulled crackling. Then,
This is Morgan Hempstead closing transmission. Acknowledge and answer our questions immediately. UMB out.
They left too much unsaid, Bickle said. He sensed the deletions for reasons of policy all through the message. The thin political line they walked had been betrayed most in what was not said.
Build consciousness into our computer, Timberlake growled. How stupid can they get?
He glanced at Bickle.
You were on one of the original attempts at UMB, John. You get the honor of telling Big Daddy where he can shove that idea.
That attempt flopped and badly, Bickle agreed, but it's still the only real course open to us. Timberlake raged on as though he hadn't heard.
There were people on the UMB fiasco who made us look like a pack of amateurs.
Flattery had heart, though, and he hid a knowing smile by turning away and speaking mildly. We all read the report, Tim.
The only part worth reading was their summation.
Timberlake pitched his voice in a sneering falsetto.
Impossible of achievement at present level of technology.
That was an excuse, not a summation, Bickle said. And he thought back to UMB's fruitless search for the artificial consciousness factor.
That's a capital A, a capital C, and a capital F, by the way. It's important.
There had always been that sterile wall between his part of the group and the station personnel, but the triple glass walls had never hidden the smell of failure. It had been all around the project from the beginning. They had been lost in tangles of pseudo-neuron fiber, in winking lights and the snap of relays, the hiss of tape reels and the bitter ozone smell of burnt insulation from overloaded circuits. They had looked for a mechanical way to do what the least among them could do within his own flesh. Be conscious. And they had failed. Over them all had hung the unspoken fear, the knowledge of what had happened to the one project that reportedly had achieved success, and its own doom, back on the surface of Earth. Timberlake cleared his throat, lifted a hand out of his couch cocoon, studied his fingernails.
Well, how are we going to answer their damn questions? They must be living in a dream world back there, expecting us to produce a detailed report on ship systems without the help of an OMC.
But they had to ask for it, Bickle said, and we'll have to doctor up some kind of report. Bickle looked at Flattery. You can cook up a report for Hempstead, Raj. Psychiatrists are experts at deception. At times, this Bickle is uncommonly aware of subtleties, Flattery thought. I must warn Prudence. All of us renounce deception, John. Just like we renounced birth and parents, Bickle said. It was easy. Somebody did it for us. Flattery knew he had to speak quickly before this conversation devolved into self-pity. He kept his attention on a tiny paint flaw in the hard-baked surface of the master board, chose his words carefully. The ship has to have conscious direction for the long haul, John. It has to. The trip involves too many unknowns that have to be dealt with on conditions of immediacy. So what do we do? You're asking me? Bickle asked. You're the psychiatrist. But I'm not the motivator here, Flattery thought. I'm not the one who can inject purpose into our efforts. This is going to require more direct methods, he said. Bickle stared at him.
Well, what are you going to tell them? Timberlake asked. They want to know why we didn't alert them when the first brain conked out. Of all the...
There's another thing, Bickle said, shifting his attention to Timberlake. They gave us no code for that particular emergency. Are we to assume they thought it was impossible for the OMCs to fail? We are not. We have to assume they had some other motive. They put the threshold high on that one for a specific purpose.
Ah, for hell's sakes, Timberlake protested. You're finding boogeymen where they don't exist, Bick.
Bickle shook his head from side to side. No, they were telling us in no uncertain terms that once we blew the whistle, we were on our own. We have to find our own long-haul driver for the tin egg. He's circling all around it, Flattery thought. When will he zero in? Bickle wet his lips with his tongue. This borderline conversation, skirting the need for a consciousness to command the ship, disturbed him deeply. He was too honest with himself to ignore this fact. Timberlake, picking up the threads of a previous conversation, said,
There was no physical reason for those brains to fail. The life systems were perfect. It's as though they committed suicide under some unknown stress.
With an abrupt gesture, Bickle shifted his AAT board into transmit phase. Okay, we'll stall 'em on their detailed report. They know it'll take time anyway. As to why we didn't alert them earlier, I've decided to tell them flatly it was because they goofed and didn't give us a code for this particular emergency. If they... You'll only get Hempstead angry, Flattery said. Hempstead angry will be more help to us than Hempstead cool and devious. Bickle said. The angry man will make mistakes. He'll let some real help slip through to us.
What makes you think Big Daddy would try to foul us up?
Timberlake asked. He's a political administrator, even if it's unconscious. Bickle hesitated. An idea had flicked into his mind, then eluded him. He went on, in a lower tone. Even if it's unconscious, he'll put political considerations ahead of anything else. His first efforts will be to keep himself in power. We're in a position to throw out political elements and concentrate on our immediate problem. To do that, we throw monkey wrenches into the political gears and focus just on what we need. The things we need will come through. Adroit, subtle, and capable of profound cunning, Flattery thought. This Bickle bears the most careful watching.
Things we need, Timberlake said. Such as what?
Such as advice from certain specialists at Moonbase, and as much computer time as they can spare us. You can't separate the political from everything else, Flattery objected. You'll only stir things up, and if you want to see what's in the bottom of the kettle, you have to give it one hell of a stir, Bickle said, and I want them to define consciousness for us. He was way ahead of me again, Flattery thought. I have to stop underestimating him. One slip could ruin everything.
Chapter 8.
Of all the Earthling's crew, Raja Lon Flattery has been provided with the most accurate information, suitably weighted, of course. This was necessary because he had to be provided with a secret terminal in his quarters through which he can monitor the mood of the ship and crew. A primary fuse has to be connected to the system, and Flattery is that fuse.
Morgan Hempstead. Lectures at Moonbase. She had come into Comm Central still feeling weak and disoriented. It was obvious that the shift of dominance had gone faster than expected, and she had forced herself to overcome her body's weaknesses, putting on a mask of well-being and composure that she did not feel. The ovoid Comm Central room should not have confused her. She had put in too many hours of training among these dials and gauges and pipes and keyboard consoles before their departure, but the feeling of unfamiliarity persisted. Then, as awareness increased, she saw the subtle changes in connections and controls and readouts. Bickle's handiwork. All the changes were necessary to put the ship on manual, she realized, but she could feel the inadequacies of what had been done. It was only then that she realized the thin edge they walked, and she turned her attention to Flattery, who was finishing out his shift on the big board. The signs of strain were obvious in his movements, still exact with a surgeon's sureness, but the control betrayed its thinning energy in the way he relaxed abruptly after each adjustment of the board. He should be relieved now, she thought, but she knew that she was not yet ready to have that great green dial point down at her, and she was not sure of the conditions of Bickle and Timberlake. Timberlake radiated glum silence. Bickle had greeted her warmly enough, then handed her a load of programming. The task obviously pointed toward construction of an electronic multi-simulation model of their main computer's core memory input-output. Much of the programming remained to be completed. She lay back on her action couch, examined the test display of one series on the screen beside her. She felt the couch's enfolding cocoon through the vac suit, wished there were time to let her body recover fully from its dehybe ordeal. The evidence was all around her, though, that she had to get to work. There was no time for the luxury of slow recuperation. Okay, you're so proud of your position and title, Prudence Lawn-Wagand, M.D., she told herself. You asked for this job. You know what you have to do. Get with it. The old self-lecture failed to rekindle her energies, and she steeled herself to hide all signs of weakness before speaking. Moonbase is taking longer to answer this time than it did before, she said, and I gave him some questions to answer. They're too busy trying to decide what our reply really means, Bickle said. Or they could be figuring out how to tell us we've bitten off more'n we can chew, Timberlake said. She heard the fear in his voice. Raj has been on that board for over 4 hours. Isn't it time someone spelled him, Tim? Flattery knew what she was doing, but could not prevent the feeling of tension from gripping his spine. There was always the possibility that Timberlake couldn't take this. Timberlake felt the dryness in his mouth. Naturally, she assumed he was giving orders here. He was the life systems man. She had not volunteered to take the board either. The bitch. But maybe it was too soon after dehybe. Metabolisms differed. She would know her own capacities, certainly. Besides, she was scheduled to follow Bickle on the board in the normal rotation. His glance followed the comm central track, the way the board circled around their positions. Bickle was in number 1 spot, then Prue, then Flattery, and he sat here on the end. It's my watch, Timberlake told himself. He felt perspiration start in his palms. Bickle had taken the board in his turn, obviously begrudging every minute away from his damned computations. He would not volunteer. I've got to take that board, Timberlake told himself. He thought of the more than 3,000 lives immediately dependent on him when that green arrow slid over to his position. All the other lives and dreams that had been poured into this project. Every bit of it pointing a finger at him. I can't, he thought. He's taking too long, Flattery thought. I'll give you the board on the count, Tim. I'm wearing pretty thin. Before Timberlake could protest, the count had started and his hand went automatically to the big red switch. Board and arrow came to him. Necessities of the job caught him immediately. Almost a third of the shield temperature control needed trimming to bring it into better balance. We should trace out the OMC linkages for this and install automatics for the gross part of the job, he thought. Presently, he fell into the routine of the watch. Here's our operating procedure, Bickle said. He looked up, caught an exchange of knowing glances between Flattery and Prue, hesitated. Something going on between those two? If it was man-woman problems, that could cause trouble. You were saying? Prudence said. Bickle saw she was staring directly at him. He cleared his throat, glanced at his figures and schematics for reassurance.
The computer must be the basis for anything we build, but we can't interface with core memory and switching controls. That means we have to use an electronic simulation model, part of the AAT system.
What about communication with Moonbase? Prudence asked.
That's a stupid question, he thought, but he hid his irritation. A switching system will automatically restore AAT function when the reply burst hits our antennas. We'll use an alarm klaxon.
Oh,
She nodded, wondering how far she could go before he realized he was being irritated purposely. This will be an operational model, he said. It'll duplicate real characteristics of the total system, but won't function as completely as the computer-based system. However, it will give us direct observation of functions with conventional equipment. It'll tell us where we have to go unconventional. The environment, the signals, and the system's parameters can be observed and changed as development progresses, and we'll only need a one-way fused link with the computer to permit it to record all our results.
this much was predictable, Flattery thought, but where does he go from here? We'll generate an environment in scaled time and apply its own effect signals to the system under analysis, Prudence said. Good. What then?
Based on my experience with the UMB experiments, Bickle answered, I can tell you which avenues aren't worth exploring and which avenues may give us an artificial consciousness. May do it. From here on in, it's cut and try.
Are we going to have to fight the time lag and possibility of transmission errors while we let Moonbase analyze our progress? Flattery asked.
Bickle glanced at his computations and schematics, looked back at Prudence. Do we have a mathematician aboard competent enough to break down the embodied transducers of our results?
Prudence looked across Bickle at the displays and stacks of schematics. She had followed enough of what he was doing there to combine that with the programming he had handed her, but it was the same old self-reflexive circle every time they faced this problem. Where did the round of consciousness begin?
Maybe I can handle the math, she said, and that's all. Just maybe.
Then which avenue do we explore first? Flattery asked.
The field theory approach, Bickle said.
Oh, great, Timberlake growled. We're going to assume that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Okay, Bickle said, but just because we can't see a thing or define it, that doesn't mean it isn't there and shouldn't be added into the sum. We're going to be juggling one hell of a lot of unknowns. The best approach to that kind of job is the engineering one. If it works, that's the answer.
Define consciousness for me, Prudence said.
We'll leave that up to the big domes at UMB, Bickle said.
And our only contact between the simulation model and the main computer will be through the loading channels? Prudence asked. What do we do about the supervisory control programs?
We're not going to touch the intercommunications lines to the computer, Bickle said. Our auxiliary will go into it through a one-way channel, fused against backlash.
Then it won't give us total simulation, she pointed out.
That's right, Bickle agreed. We'll have an error coefficient to contend with all along the line. If it gets too high, we change our plan of attack. The simulator will be just an auxiliary, kind of dumb in some respects.
And there's no way for this auxiliary to run wild? Flattery asked.
Its supervisory program will always be one of us, Bickle said, fighting to keep irritation from his voice. One of us will always be in the driver's seat. We'll drive it, like we drive an ox pulling a wagon.
This ox won't have any ideas of its own, eh? Flattery persisted.
Not unless we solve the consciousness problem, Bickle said.
Gah!
Flattery's word pounced.
And when it's conscious, what then? He asked.
Bickle blinked at him, absorbing this. Presently he said,
I suppose it'll be like a newborn baby, in a sense.
What baby was ever born with all the information and stored experiences of this ship's master computer? Flattery demanded.
Bickle's being fed this too fast,
Prudence thought. If he's kept too much off balance, he may rebel or start to probe in the wrong places. He mustn't guess. Well, the human is born with instincts, Bickle said, and we do train the human baby into humanity. I find the moral and religious aspects of this whole idea faintly repugnant, Flattery declared flatly. I think there's sin here. If not hubris, then something equally evil. Prudence stared at him. Flattery betrayed signs of real agitation. A flush in his cheeks, fingers trembling, eyes bright and glaring. That wasn't in the program, she thought. Perhaps he's tired. All right, she said. We'll construct a field of interacting impulses, and that puts us right smack dab into a games theory problem where countless bits are... Oh, no, Bickle snapped. The UMB stab at this thing got all fouled up with games theory ideas like the command constant and mobility constant and inner-outer directed behavior. It took me one hell of a long time to realize that they didn't know what they were talking about. Easy for you to say, Prudence said, holding her voice to a slow, cold beat. You forget I saw the games machine they produced. The more it was used, the more it changed in... Okay, it changed, Bickle admitted. The machine absorbed part of its personality from its opponents. What's that mean? It had some of the characteristics of consciousness, sure, but it wasn't conscious. She turned away, conveying a sneer by the movement alone. He has to think he can rely on no one but himself. Flattery shifted his attention from Bickle to Prudence and back. He found it increasingly difficult to hide his resentment of Bickle. Psychiatrist, heal thyself, he thought. Bickle has to take charge. I'm just the safety fuse. Flattery glanced at the false plate on his personal repeater board, thinking of the trigger beneath that plate and the mate to it in his quarters concealed by the lines of the sacred graphic in the bulkhead. On the bulkhead, sorry. Arbitrary turnback command, Flattery reminded himself. That was the code signal he must listen for from UMB. That was the signal he must obey, unless he judged the ship had to be destroyed before receiving that signal. A simple push on one of the hidden triggers would activate the master program in the ship's computer, open airlocks, set off explosive charges. Death and destruction for crew, ship, all the colonists and their supplies. Colonists and their supplies, Flattery thought. He was too good a psychiatrist not to recognize the guilt motives behind the careful provisioning of this ship.
If you solve the artificial consciousness problem, you can plant a human colony somewhere in space. Not at Tau Ceti, of course, but...
And he was too good a divine not to penetrate the religious hokum, not to see through to the essential rightness of his role in the project. Given the known perils, there had to be a safety fuse. There had to be someone willing and able to blow up the ship. Flattery knew the reasons. They were reality of the most brutal kind. The first crude attempts at mechanical reproduction of consciousness had been made on an island in Puget Sound. The island no longer existed. "Rogue consciousness!" they had screamed. True enough. Something had defied natural laws, slaughtered lab personnel, destroyed sensors, sent slashing beams of pure destruction through the surrounding countryside. Finally, it had taken the island. God knew where. Poof! No island. No lab personnel. Nothing but gray water and a cold north wind whipping whitecaps across it, and the fish and the seaweed invading the area where land and men and machinery had been. Just thinking about it made Flattery shiver. He conjured up in his mind the image of the sacred graphic from his quarters, absorbed some of the peace from the field of serenity, the tranquility of the holy faces. Even Moonbase didn't walk too close to this project now. It was all a sham to educate ship personnel, to frustrate the eager young men and women.
Each project ship must maintain its coefficient of frustration, went the private admonition. Frustration must come from both human and mechanical sources.
They thought of frustration as a threshold, a factor to heighten awareness. It made a weird kind of sense. Thus, there were crew members like Flattery, and Prudence Lawn-Wagoned, and machinery that broke down, robots repair units that had to have a human monitor every second, and programmed emergencies to complicate real emergencies. And that, I think, will do it for now. Yes, I think that will do it for this week. Yes. Let me just find where we're going to make a chapter break next week. That'll probably be fine. And yeah, so we are off and running now. Well and truly starting to sprint. So there's a lot that goes down really early on. It's crazy off rip. Like, we're introduced on the first page to disembodied brains in boxes running the ship, but we're like already past that because it's like, oh, well, they all failed. So not only did they fail, they catastrophically failed. Two of them went catatonic, one of them went deliriously insane. Well, okay, all of them went insane, but the other went homicidal. So, and then, we had we tried to make an artificial consciousness, and it backfired. But it may be our only hope. So, things get nuts right out the gate. It is relentless. It's great. It's very good fun. One of the things I kind of love about Frank Herbert is he loves doing internal monologues. He loves them. He loves people talking in their heads. He loves it, and you really come to appreciate it. Um, it. Other authors do it, but no one really quite does it with as obsessive a dedication as Frank Herbert does. Like, internal monologue is a huge portion of his books. And it's great. So yeah, we are off and running. Um, Hopefully people enjoyed. I think we should be on course, barring unforeseen calamities, to have this one done uh, by uh, by August. Um, then I'm gone for 2 weeks, helping people do things. It's not really a vacation as such. I wish. Oh, how I wish. But I won't be present. I'm contemplating trying to maybe bring along at least my headset and use like a tablet or something. I don't have any tablets, but they do, and maybe I'll get some in. But I'm going to assume for now that it's not going to happen, and you should too. So there. Um, so going forward, for Mondays we will be starting Armor by John Stakely. I don't think we'll be done that by the time August rolls around, but we will try. And Wednesday, I've got a nice little treat planned, which won't take too many streams, um, but I think should be at least enjoyable. It is tangentially related to the Wuxia Wednesdays, um, but only slightly. Uh, in that it's in that I think there's an argument to be made that it could be considered a martial fantasy. Anyway, and it's a translated work, so there's that too. So anyway, that'll do it for today. I will see you all Monday, possibly. Thanks to everybody who tuned in. If you are listening to this after the fact, or tuning in for the first time, hi, I'm Fragath. I do these streams every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, starting at 12 noon Eastern Time, or UTC -5. Um,
you can catch me then. I usually start a couple minutes late, as I did today, regrettably. So you are rarely missing much if you wind up tuning in late. Other than that, you can find all of my prior work, bar Echopraxia, on my YouTube channel, all in playlists. At the end of this month, actually, I'll do it this weekend. Um, yeah, this weekend I'll have everything updated into its proper playlists um, for the next month or so. So that'll be good. That'll be nice. Nicely organized. Fortunately, didn't look like we had any technical issues today, which is great. We did have some on Wednesday, which drove me a little stark, but because I thought I had my problems solved, but evidently this was one that decided to come up out of nowhere. Anyway, that'll do it for me. Thanks again to everyone who tuned in, and thanks to anyone listening in. Stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other. And yeah, don't go making no, artificial consciousnesses that decide to steal an island out of the Puget Sound. People live there. Well, they probably didn't. They definitely don't now, because there's no island. It's gone. Goodbye. Zap. Alrighty, see you all later.